The air inside the saloon was thick with sweat, smoke, and the stink of spilled beer. Laughter rang out in crude bursts as rough men gathered around a makeshift platform in the corner. The card tables had been pushed aside, and the piano had gone silent. Something more profitable than music was about to begin. Clara stood at the edge of the platform, hands bound in front of her with a frayed leather strap. Dirt caked her bare feet. Her hair hung in oily strands around her bruised face, and her dress, once white, was torn at the seams, stained with mud and worse. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stared straight ahead, teeth clenched. As the auctioneer grinned and pushed her forward. Now, the man crooned, lifting her chin with 2 fingers so the crowd could see her face. Ain't she a fine little stray? Skin and bones, sure, but she'll clean up nice. Or maybe you like 'em wild. Laughter erupted. Coins clinked. Clara closed her eyes. It had taken her 3 months to escape the brothel in Laredo. She'd run until her feet bled, slept in barns, stolen bread, and avoided every lawman she saw. She knew what happened to girls like her. They didn't get second chances. They got hunted, sold, owned. She'd made it as far as Whistler's Ridge before someone turned her in for a bounty. Now here she was, being auctioned like cattle in a saloon filled with wolves. "Let's start the bidding at $1, the auctioneer shouted. "Come on now," boys look at her. Stubborn, quiet. Not a sound from her. That's value. A few hands went up. $1, $1.50. Then silence. Clara dared a glance at the crowd. No one looked at her like a person. Just a thing. A broken thing. One man licked his lips. Another chuckled and shook his head. "She ain't worth feedin'," he muttered. $2. The auctioneer barked. "2? Anyone? No?" Someone near the bar laughed. "She won't last a week. I've seen healthier rabbits." $2, a voice finally mumbled. "Thank you." That's the spirit. The bidding stopped again. The auctioneer sighed. "Gentlemen, you offend me. This here's a bargain." No one moved. Clara stared at the floorboards. Her heart beat like a hammer in her chest, but she willed herself to look calm. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "Going once," the auctioneer said. "Twice," a long pause. The crowd turned as the creak of boots echoed from the back of the room. Someone was moving. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, his wide-brimmed hat low over his face. His coat was dusty, boots scuffed. A rifle was slung over his shoulder, and a coil of rope hung from his saddlebag. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. He stopped just short of the platform. The room quieted. Even the drunk in the back shut up. The cowboy lifted one hand. Just one. "6," he said. That was all. One word. A low, gravel-scraped voice that hadn't spoken in hours or maybe years. The auctioneer blinked. $6? The man didn't respond. He just looked at Clara. A beat passed. The saloon filled with uneasy murmurs. "He's serious?" "Someone whispered." The auctioneer scratched his neck, chuckled awkwardly. "Well, 6 it is. Going once, twice sold." There was no cheer, no applause. Just the soft jingle of coins as the cowboy dropped them on the table and stepped onto the platform. Clara's eyes met his. For the first time all night, she saw something different. No hunger, no cruelty. Just quiet. Something inside her cracked, and her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the floor. He didn't speak again. Didn't ask her name or tell her. He just carried her out of the saloon like she weighed nothing and lifted her onto the back of a bay mare tied outside. He mounted behind her, wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her, and rode off into the darkness, away from the noise, the eyes, the past. The crowd drifted apart, confused and a little shaken. And somewhere, Deep in the night, a girl bought for $6 dared to believe for the first time in years that she might live to see the morning. The prairie wind was cold as they rode through the night, but Clara didn't feel it, not really. Her mind was fogged, her limbs weak, and her eyes stung from holding back tears she wouldn't allow to fall. The cowboy rode without a word, his hands steady at her waist, his body warm behind her. He didn't ask where she came from or who she was. He didn't look at her with curiosity or pity. He simply rode quiet, constant shore. The mare's hoofs clopped in a slow, rhythmic beat across the dirt road, and the stars above stretched wide and endless. For the first time in weeks, Clara didn't feel hunted. She didn't feel caged. She just felt carried. They rode until dawn. When the horizon started to glow with pale gold and the scrubland gave way to rocky ridges, the cowboy finally turned off the road. He guided the mare up a narrow path, flanked by trees and brush, until they crested a small hill. Below them sat a lonely cabin, weather-worn, slanted from wind and time, but standing. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. Fencing surrounded the back pasture where a few horses grazed freely. There was no town, no saloon, no railroad tracks, just space. Silence. He dismounted first, then helped Clara down. She winced as her feet touched the ground. The solace were torn and raw, and her legs trembled. Still, she stood. The cowboy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded wool blanket, draping it around her shoulders. Then, without a word, he turned and opened the cabin door. Clara hesitated, heart thumping. Was this it? Another place to be kept? Owned. But when he stepped aside to let her pass first, head slightly bowed, like she was the guest, not the stray, Clara's doubt wavered. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. A single bed set against the far wall, covered in clean linens. A table with 2 chairs stood by the window. There were shelves lined with jars, beans, flour, herbs, and a small iron stove where a kettle steamed gently. She caught the scent of brewed coffee and dried meat. The cowboy moved to the counter, pouring hot water into a tin mug. He handed it to her without a word, then reached for a loaf of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Clara took it slowly, unsure. But her stomach growled louder than her hesitation, and she tore a piece off and ate with quiet desperation. He watched for a moment, then nodded once almost to himself and stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind him. Clara sat for a long while, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of wood. The warmth of the drink soothed her throat. The bread felt like the first real food she'd had in months. Who was he? When she finally dared peek outside, she found him in the small corral behind the cabin, tossing hay to the horses. His coat hung on a fence post, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow. The rising sun cast gold over his broad shoulders, and the clean lines of his movements. Clara didn't approach. She just watched. He didn't ask anything of her. He didn't demand thanks. He simply existed with a kind of quiet that calmed her nerves and confused her heart. Every man she'd known until now wanted something, usually everything. But this man, the one who had spoken only a single word to buy her life, seemed content to say nothing at all. Later that afternoon, he returned to the cabin carrying a bucket of warm water. He set it near the hearth, then pointed toward the bed. Clara hesitated. "You want me to rest?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "You got a name?" He paused for a beat, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small piece of folded paper, and handed it to her. In clean, rough handwriting were 2 words, Eli Walker. She looked up at him. "You can write, but you don't talk?" He gave a short nod. "Why?" He didn't answer. Clara let out a breath. "Guess I've got secrets too." She watched him turn toward the door again, ready to give her space. "Thank you," she whispered. He stopped, his back still to her. Then, with the faintest nod, He walked outside once more. In that silence, something unspoken began to grow between them. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the fragile, flickering spark of something like safety. And for Clara, that was more than she dared hope for. The wind howled across the ridge, tugging at the brittle branches outside the cabin. Clara sat by the window, knees drawn up to her chest beneath the wool blanket Eli had given her. The sun had long dipped behind the hills, leaving only the soft, orange glow of the fire to light the one-room home. Eli hadn't returned. He'd left at sunset without a word, just saddled his horse, grabbed his rifle, and rode down the path. Clara hadn't asked where he was going. She hadn't dared. But now the silence around her stretched too long, too wide. Each creak in the wooden walls set her nerves on edge. Was this some sort of trick? Had he only brought her here to leave her? Or worse, had someone followed them? She stood and crept toward the door, listening. Nothing but wind and the distant cry of a night bird. No voices, no horses, no boots crunching gravel. But Clara knew danger rarely announced itself. She walked back to the bed, her feet still raw but no longer bleeding. Ellie had left salve and fresh bandages beside a bowl of warm water. She'd tended herself as best she could, confused by his kindness. Kindness was dangerous. It made her heart too soft. It made her hope. That night she didn't sleep. Not really. She lay under the heavy quilt, ears alert, eyes staring at the low beams of the ceiling. She didn't know how much time passed before she heard the faint hoofbeats in the distance. Her breath caught. She sat up slowly, moving toward the window. The fire had died down, casting everything in shadow. Then she saw it, Eli riding up the hill. Alone. When he reached the cabin, he didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, brushing dust from his coat. His face was expressionless, but his eyes flicked to hers, scanning her like he needed to know she was still there. Still safe. Where'd you go? She asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he unstrapped a small burlap sack from his saddle and set it on the table. Clara approached slowly and opened it. Inside were apples. Real apples. Red, fresh, stolen from somewhere close. And something else, an envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. She looked at him. What's this? He gestured. Read it. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the paper inside. Warning. The girl from the Loretto brothel has been spotted in Whistler's Ridge. Reward. $50 for her return. Hire for her silence. No questions asked. Clara's hands trembled. She looked up at him. They're still looking for me. Eli nodded once. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. You went to find this? You risked being seen for me? He didn't reply. Just stepped back, pulling off his hat and brushing a hand through his hair. He looked tired, heavy. You don't even know me, she whispered. He walked over to the hearth, picked up the poker, and stirred the dying coals. After a moment, he pulled another folded paper from his coat and handed it to her. It was older, brittle at the corners. A photograph slipped out, two young girls standing in front of a church. One looked just like Clara, the other was someone else entirely. On the back was written in pencil, Sarah Walker, age 14, missing. Clara looked at him. She was your sister? He nodded. What happened to her? His jaw tightened. He turned away and stared into the fire. Clara clutched the photo. You think what happened to her is what would have happened to me. He didn't nod this time. He didn't have to. They stood in silence for a long time, the fire slowly breathing life back into the room. Finally, Clara stepped closer, held out the photograph. I'm sorry. Eli took it gently, then placed it back in his coat pocket. The moment passed like smoke, quiet and fading, but it changed something in the air between them. Later that night, he made a place for himself near the hearth, laying a blanket on the floor while Clara kept the bed. She tried to protest, but he shook his head. As she drifted off to sleep, truly asleep this time, she heard him moving softly around the cabin, checking the locks, watching the windows. Not a word was spoken. But in the silence, she knew. He wasn't just hiding her. He was protecting her, and maybe, just maybe, protecting himself too. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Clara hadn't known since she was a child, if ever. There was no shouting, no doors slammed, no men clawing for her wrists or ordering her around. Just the creak of the windmill, the low murmur of horses, and the rustle of cottonwood leaves swaying in the wind. And Eli always near, always silent. Cabin became their shared space, but he never invaded hers. Each morning, he left her fresh coffee and went about his chores, fixing fences, feeding horses, mending tools. Clara, still limping but stronger by the day, took it upon herself to clean, patch the curtains, and replant the long-dead herb garden outside the kitchen window. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't object. By the fourth morning, she found a bundle of thread and scraps of calico cloth left on the table. No note, no explanation. Just a quiet gift. She stood for a long time holding it in her hands, stunned by the kindness. The girl she had been just weeks ago starving, hiding in a barn loft, would never have believed she'd end up here. Free. Not owned. Not chased. Healing. That night, Clara cooked stew using what few spices she found in the cupboard and wild onions from the field. Eli sat across from her at the table, sipping slowly, his eyes downcast but warm. A kind of peace hovered between them, fragile, unspoken, but real. As the fire cracked and shadows played across the floor, Clara finally asked, "You ever get lonely out here?" Eli looked up, surprised. Then slowly he nodded. "Why stay?" she asked gently. He stared at her for a moment, then rose from the table. From a shelf above the hearth, he pulled down a wooden box and handed it to her. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings. Photos, letters, all telling fragments of a story. A Confederate soldier dishonorably discharged. A sister missing from a church school. A mother dead from illness. A warrant that was never filed. Names struck out. Pages torn. Pieces of a life Clara could only guess at, but the pain within them was clear. "You're not hiding from the law," she murmured. "You're hiding from the past." Eli gave her a long, unreadable look. Then he nodded once. She closed the box and placed it gently on the table. "You're not the only one." Later that evening, Clara sat out on the porch with a needle in hand, stitching together the scraps he'd left her. She wasn't sure what she was making, maybe just trying to feel useful, but it calmed her. The way the steady rhythm of thread and fabric echoed her heartbeat. Eli joined her, sitting on the steps. He didn't speak, just cleaned his rifle in the fading light, his presence steady, grounding. As the stars blinked to life overhead, Clara said, almost to herself, "You saved me, and you don't even know why." He paused, then picked up a twig and began to draw slowly in the dirt at his feet. A horse, a tiny house, a tree, and then two stick figures, a small one with long hair and a taller one beside it. Holding hands, Clara's breath hitched. "You think we're family now?" she whispered. He didn't answer. Just nodded once, slowly, then rubbed the sketch. Away with his boot. She stared at the smudged dirt. The idea seemed impossible, but in some strange, wordless way, Eli had told her what no man ever had. You're not a burden. You're not broken. You're not alone. That night, she slept more deeply than she had in years. In the following days, Clara continued to heal. The cuts on her feet closed, her face lost its haunted pallor, and her eyes, once rimmed with exhaustion and fear, began to shine again. She brushed and fed the horses, learned to tend the vegetable patch Eli barely touched. Even taught herself to make coffee the way he likes, strong, black, and boiling hot. Each evening, they sat together in silence. No need for words. It wasn't romance. Not yet, but it was something deeper, a sanctuary carved out of pain. A quiet companionship born of wounds that didn't need to be explained to be understood. For the first time in a long, long while, Clara wasn't running. The first time Clara saw the trader, she froze mid-step. She'd ridden into the trading post with Eli to gather supplies. It was a tiny outpost, just a store, a livery, and a rusted water pump on the edge of the canyon. She'd thought it was far enough from Whistler's Ridge to avoid attention. She thought her past had finally stopped chasing her. She was wrong. He stood near the feed sacks, chewing on a matchstick, heavyset with a hat pulled low. His face was sunburned and peeling, but Clara recognized the scar on his cheek, the yellow teeth, and the way his gaze swept over women like they were livestock. His name was Greaves, and 3 months ago, he'd been the one who tried to tame her for the brothel owner back in Laredo. Her heart thudded like a warning drum in her chest. Greaves didn't notice her at first. He was arguing with the shopkeep about the price of beans. But then Clara made the mistake of backing up too fast, knocking over a crate of potatoes. The crash turned every head, including his. Their eyes met. She saw the moment recognition sparked. The curl of his lip. The sick delight. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, "if it ain't the little runaway." Eli was at her side in an instant. He hadn't spoken since they arrived, but he stepped between her and Greaves like a wall of muscle and shadow. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol. Greaves laughed. "She with you, cowboy?" Eli said nothing. "She's got a price on her, you know. Last I heard, $50 alive. A lot more dead if she starts talking. You might want to think twice about keeping her." Eli didn't flinch. His fingers curled tighter around the pistol. Clara grabbed his sleeve. "Let's go," she whispered. "Please." Greaves tipped his hat mockingly. "Won't be hard to find you. Pretty girl like her don't blend in for long." Eli's eyes locked onto Greaves with a look that could burn through bone. But he didn't draw. He simply turned and guided Clara out of the store. They rode hard all the way back to the cabin, dust rising in a thick cloud behind them. Clara barely spoke, too shaken by the encounter. But when they finally reached the ridge, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "He knows," she choked out, sliding off the horse and pacing the clearing in front of the cabin. "He'll tell the others. They'll come. They'll come for me." Eli dismounted slowly, calm in the face of her storm. But his jaw was tight, and his eyes scanned the horizon like he was already preparing for war. "They'll take me back," Clara whispered, voice cracking. "And if they can't, they'll kill me." Eli walked over to her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "I can't go through that again," she said, trembling. Then something she hadn't expected happened. Eli reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather notebook and a stub of charcoal, and wrote something carefully on the page. He handed it to her. "You're not going back. Ever." She stared at the words. So simple, so certain. "But you saw what happened in town. One of them fines. U.S., the rest will follow. I'm a problem, Eli. I'm a target." He wrote again. "So am I, but I've learned how to make people disappear if I have to." The words sent a chill through her. Not because she feared him, but because she believed him. That night, neither of them slept much. Eli sharpened his knife by the fire, checked and rechecked his rifle. Clara cleaned out the cabin pantry and organized what little they had. The threat had returned, and with it, the walls around her heart began to rise again. But as she watched Eli move through the shadows, quiet and deliberate, she realized something important. He wasn't running from fear. He was preparing to fight. For her. For both of them. The past was coming. That much was certain. But for the first time, Clara wasn't alone. And she wasn't powerless. She was part of something. Something strong, if quiet. Something worth defending. The wind had changed. Clara could feel it, dry and restless, crawling in from the south like a warning. By morning, the sky was heavy with dust, and the horses grew skittish in their stalls. Eli had already packed the rifle, closed the shutters, and reinforced the door. Without saying a word, he was preparing for something Clara didn't want to. "Imagine. They're coming," she whispered, standing by the window. "Aren't they?" Eli didn't answer. He was outside, chopping wood in the early light, but his eyes kept flicking toward the horizon like he could see something she couldn't. Clara's stomach twisted. "We can leave," she said when he came back in. "Ride through the canyon. Disappear into Mexico." "You said you knew how to make people disappear." Eli shook his head. She grabbed his arm. "Then what do we do? Wait until they burn this place down with us in it?" Still, he said nothing. But there was tension in the lines of his shoulders, in the way his hand hovered near his belt where his gun hung. Later that afternoon, she saw the dust trail rising in the distance, small at first, then growing, kicked out by at least 3 horses. Clara ran to the barn, grabbing Eli's rifle, her hands trembling. She shoved bullets into the chamber just as he stepped in behind her. He looked at her, surprised. She met his gaze squarely. "I'm not hiding in the cellar," she said. "Not again." Eli stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and firm, and handed her his second revolver. When the riders finally arrived, they didn't bother to hide their purpose. Greaves was at the front, flanked by 2 others, both with rifles across their laps and smirks on their faces. "Afternoon," Greaves called out, remaining on his horse. "Heard this ranch was hiding a girl worth some real money." Eli stepped forward, rifle resting across his forearm. His hat cast a shadow over his face. Clara watched from the porch, gun at her side. "We don't want trouble," Greaves said, smiling coldly. "Just the girl. You give her up, we'll be gone. No need to turn this place into a graveyard." Eli didn't move. Greaves chuckled. "Come on now. We both know she's not worth dying over. She ain't your kin, ain't even your kind. Eli's." J-O-T-E-N-S-E-D. Then, finally, he spoke. "You'll have to go through me." The words were low, rough, and deliberate. His voice sounded like it had been torn from somewhere deep inside, unused for years, but it carried like a gunshot. Through the still air, Greaves's smile faded. "What was that?" Eli raised his rifle. "You heard me." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't known how much she needed to hear his voice until that moment. It wasn't just about defiance, it was about truth. He wasn't just protecting. Heard that he was choosing her. Greaves spat in the dirt. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Eli didn't answer. The standoff stretched long enough for birds to fall silent in the trees. Then, in a flash, one of the riders moved for his gun. A shot cracked the air. The man fell from his horse, hitting the ground with a thud. Eli didn't hesitate. He fired again, grazing the second man's shoulder and sending him screaming into the dust. Greaves turned his horse with a snarl. "This ain't over," he shouted as he galloped off, the wounded man limping after him. Eli didn't lower the rifle until they vanished from view. Clara stood frozen on the porch, heart pounding. She dropped the revolver in the dirt and ran to him. "You spoke," she said breathlessly. "You God, Eli, you spoke." He looked at her, that same unreadable depth in his eyes. Then, quietly, he nodded. "Why now?" She whispered. He took a deep breath. His voice was still rough, but steady. "Because you're not someone I'm willing to lose." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She just stood there, hand on his chest, feeling the beat of his heart beneath. The dirt and flannel. He'd found his voice for her, and she, for the first time, felt truly heard. The sky turned dark with storm clouds that night, but it wasn't rain Clara feared. It was return. She'd seen it in Greaves's face, the kind of man who didn't like to lose, who took a gunshot like a personal insult. He would be back, and not with just 2 lackeys this time. He'd bring more, and he wouldn't be so polite. Eli knew it too. He hadn't spoken again since the standoff, but something in him had shifted. He moved with purpose now, eyes sharp, every muscle taut. Like a coiled spring. They had 1 night, maybe 2, to prepare. Clara didn't wait for Eli to ask. She rolled up her sleeves and followed him outside. Together, they boarded up the cabin windows with old fence posts, reinforced the barn door, dug shallow foxholes just beyond the corral fence and filled them with sharpened sticks and broken glass. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for once, Clara wasn't just the girl being protected. She was preparing to protect. Inside the cabin, she packed food into sacks, tied up canteens, and loaded bullets into every chamber they had. She even lined her coat with knives and tucked a small derringer into her boot. She wasn't afraid of blood anymore. She was afraid of being helpless. Eli watched her work, quiet approval in his eyes. You said you knew how to make people disappear, Clara said softly as she rechecked the bolt on the back door. That's still true? He nodded once. Then we disappear together? Or not at all? For a long moment, he just looked at her. And then, without speaking, he placed a hand on her shoulder. A silent promise. That night, thunder cracked the sky open and rain finally fell heavy and hard, washing over the land like baptism. But Clara didn't sleep, and neither did Eli. They sat on the floor, backs against the cabin wall, rifles across their laps, boots laced tight. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows, and outside the wind moaned through the trees. Sometime near dawn, the first sound came. A branch snapped. Then another. Clara's hand gripped the rifle. She looked to Eli. He gave a single nod, then moved toward the back window. He cracked it open just enough to see, and there, between the trees, were 5 riders. All armed. Greaves had returned. She met Eli's gaze, and this time she didn't wait for direction. She slipped through the side door, moving low, just like he'd shown her earlier. The rain had turned the dirt to mud, muffling her steps. She crawled behind the woodpile they'd stacked earlier and waited. From the front of the cabin, she heard Greaves's voice. I warned you, Walker, he shouted. You think I'm gonna let you embarrass me like that? No reply. You think I'm scared of some mute with a busted rifle? Or that little girl who thinks hiding in your lap makes her safe? Still nothing. Then came a louder command. Burn it down. Clara's breath caught. 2 of the men began advancing with oil flasks and torches, and that's when Clara rose from behind the woodpile and fired. 1 torch dropped with a hiss into the mud. The other man screamed, hit in the shoulder. He stumbled backward. Up there, someone shouted. She's outside. But Clara didn't run. She fired again, aiming low, like Eli taught her. Then she darted left, disappearing behind the barn. Gunshots rang out, but she was already gone. From inside the cabin, Eli opened fire too quick, precise, hitting one of the riders and sending the others scattering. The land erupted into chaos, hooves thundering, bullets cracking, rain soaking. Every surface. Clara made it to the chicken coop, crouched low. She reloaded with trembling hands, mud smearing her fingers. But her mind was clear, focused. She'd been hunted before. Not this time. She saw Greaves trying to circle toward the barn. She took aim, but her fingers hesitated. Then she remembered the cage, the bruises, the collar they'd once tried to put around her neck. She fired. Greaves dropped to 1 knee, cursing, his leg torn open. Eli stepped out from behind the barn, rifle raised. Greaves looked up, wild, wet, panting. She ain't worth it, he snarled. Neither of you are. Eli's voice cut through the storm like a blade. She's worth everything. Greaves paled Dot then. For the second time, he turned and ran Dot by sunrise. The clearing was still. The outlaws were gone wounded, beaten, scattered like the ghosts. They were Dot. Clara stood beside Eli, soaked to the bone, hair clinging to her cheeks, hands still shaking. But she didn't feel afraid. She felt powerful. Because this time, when the devil came calling, she fought back. The rain had passed by mid-morning, but the storm's aftermath lingered in the soaked earth and splintered fences. Smoke still curled faintly from the smoldering barn wall where a torch had briefly caught. Eli had stomped it out before it spread. Now, he stood at the edge of the pasture, silent and still, scanning the tree line for any sign of return. Clara watched him from the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, fingers still raw from the night's fight. Her knees ached, her right hand was bruised, and a scrape along her jaw throbbed where a bullet had grazed her as she dove for cover. But her spine was straight, and her eyes didn't blink when they looked into the woods. They had survived. Again. She walked out to where Eli stood. He didn't turn to her, but she could tell he'd heard her approach. "They'll be back," she said, her voice quiet. "Not Greaves. He won't be riding again for a long time, but someone else will come. Someone always does." Eli nodded once, then looked at her. Clara squared her shoulders. "Then we stop waiting for them." She held up a folded paper, a letter she'd written by lantern light after the fight. Her handwriting was stiff and uncertain, but the words were strong. She had addressed it to a judge in Austin, one she'd heard about from a kind rancher's wife back in Laredo, a man who was investigating outlaw auction networks and border corruption, a man who had power and wasn't afraid to use it. "I told him everything," she said. "What they did, what I saw, names, locations. He might not care, but if he does, he can do what we can't." Eli took the letter from her gently and read it. When he looked back at her, there was a hint of something new in his expression, not surprise. Not concern. Pride. Clara hesitated. "You think I'm making a mistake?" He shook his head. "Then, can you take it to town?" "The post office in Broxton. It's far enough. Safer than the Ridge." Eli looked at her long and hard. Then he stepped into the barn, saddled the mare, and rode out within the hour. Clara watched him disappear over the rise. He was gone for 3 days. Clara spent that time rebuilding. She mended what she could: chicken coops, tools, even the broken fence post near the back pasture. She gathered herbs, dried meat, and read through Eli's old books by lantern light. But more than that, she thought about what it meant to stay, not just survive, not just hide, but build something. On the second night, she stood outside under the stars and whispered aloud, "I want more than to just keep breathing." It felt like a confession. Or maybe a prayer. Eli returned on the third evening, tired and covered in trail dust, but alive and in one piece. When Clara opened the cabin door, he handed her a slip of paper, a receipt from the Broxton post office. The letter had been sent, but it wasn't the only thing he brought. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a canvas-wrapped package and placed it in her hands. Inside was a brand-new journal, 3 fountain pens, and a bottle of ink. On the inside cover, he'd written just 2 words: "Your story." Her throat tightened. She looked up at him, blinking through the heat in her eyes. "You think anyone will want to read it?" He didn't speak. He just nodded. That night, Clara lit the lantern, cracked open the journal, and began to write. Not just about the brothel or the auctions. Not just the fear. She wrote about the porch swing, the sound of Eli chopping wood, the first time she made stew that didn't taste like ash, the way silence, when shared with someone who understood it, didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. She wrote about the girl who was auctioned for $5 and bought by a man who didn't say a word, a man who had saved her, and whom she might just be saving to. By the time dawn arrived, the pages were already filling. She was no longer a fugitive. No longer prey. She was something else. Now, a witness, a fighter, a woman with a voice and a name that would no longer be whispered in fear, but written in ink. Asterisk. The letter must have landed in the right hands, because 3 weeks later, just as the sun began to dip below the canyon wall, a single rider approached the ranch, wearing a black coat and a badge that glinted like firelight. Clara was tending to the chickens when she saw the silhouette rise over the ridge. Her breath caught. She dropped the feed pail and ran to the cabin. Eli stepped onto the porch with his rifle slung low, cautious but calm. He narrowed his eyes toward the trail as the rider drew closer, dust trailing behind the horse's hooves like a veil. The man dismounted before the fence. His horse was lean but powerful, saddlebag stamped with the seal of the state of Texas. He didn't shout or demand entry. He just waited. Eli didn't lower his guard, but Clara did. She stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're from Austin?" The man nodded. "Judge Raylan Chambers," he said, pulling a folded envelope from his coat. "You sent me something that kept me up 3 nights in a row." Clara reached for the letter, hands trembling. You read it?" "I read every word." His voice was gravel-low and steady. "I've been after Greaves and men like him for years." "But what you wrote? Names, dates, hiding spots?" "That was the key we needed." Clara glanced at Eli, who was still watching the judge like a man waiting for a trap to spring. Chambers followed her gaze. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "I don't expect it. But what you did, you cracked open something real. The state's ready to move. I've got marshals already riding. There'll be arrests across 3 counties by next week." Clara's mouth went dry. "Will they come here?" "Only if you want them to," the judge said. "But I'll warn you, once this gets out, your name might not stay hidden." A long silence followed. Eli finally stepped forward and stood beside Clara. The judge tilted his head. "You the cowboy who didn't speak?" Eli gave a faint nod. "Well, you don't need words to make an impression. You just need a backbone." He looked back at Clara. "You've both got plenty of that." Clara folded the envelope in her hand, trying to steady her breath. "So what now?" "That depends," the judge said. "If you stay here, people might come. Survivors. Girls like you. Some will want help. Some will want revenge. Others might just want someone to tell them they're not crazy." Her throat tightened. "You could come to Austin," the judge added. "Testify. Put this whole damn mess on the record." Eli stiffened. Clara looked at him, her fingers brushing his. She turned back to Chambers. "We'll think about it. That's all I ask." The judge handed her one more envelope before turning to mount his horse. "I wrote down names of some women you helped without knowing it. If you ever want to find them, they'll be waiting." He tipped his hat to Eli. "You're a hard man to find." Eli finally spoke soft, steady. "I aim to stay that way." Chambers gave a slight smile. "Then keep her close. A voice like hers changes things." With that, he rode off, vanishing over the same rise he'd come from. That night, Clara and Eli sat on the porch as the stars came out, brighter than ever in the clear desert sky. She held the judge's letter in her lap and stared into the dark. "I thought I'd feel relief," she said quietly. "But I feel something else." Eli looked at her, waiting. "Responsibility," she whispered. "Like now that they know, I can't just disappear. Not anymore." Eli's voice was low. "You don't have to disappear. You can decide what you become." She smiled faintly, touched by the weight of his words. He was right, she wasn't a runaway anymore. She wasn't a caged girl waiting to be saved. She was a name on a letter that sparked justice. A voice that others might follow. A story that wouldn't die quietly. She looked at Eli, her voice soft. If I go to Austin, will you come with me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. And with that one word, his second promise, Clara knew. The next chapter had already begun. They left at sunrise. The wind was cool, the trail quiet, and the saddle beneath Clara felt like something familiar, now not a burden, but a seat of strength. Eli rode beside her, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, rifle holstered but always close. They rode not as fugitives this time, but as witnesses. As fighters. As a pair who had walked through fire and found something whole on the other side. Austin was still days away, and Clara knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. There would be testimony, faces from her nightmares, questions designed to twist the truth. But she didn't fear it anymore, because this wasn't just about her. It was about the girls still trapped, the ones who didn't escape, the ones whose names would never be written down unless she spoke them. Eli hadn't said much since they left the ranch, but his presence was louder than any words. Every time she glanced over and saw him steady in the saddle, it steadied her too. By the third day, the land changed from dust to green. The hills grew gentler, the roads wider. At night, they camped beneath mesquite trees and cooked quietly, over open flames. Sometimes Eli read from one of his old books. Sometimes Clara wrote in her journal until her fingers ached. On the fifth day, the city's edges came into view. Austin, with its tall buildings and gas lamps, its noise and smoke and promise. Clara pulled the reins, her horse slowing atop the final ridge before the descent. Eli stopped beside her. Looks bigger than I remember, she whispered. He nodded once. You sure you want to go in with me? Eli looked at her, then not just looked, but saw her. The scars on her wrists faded now, the burn across her left hand, the fire in her eyes, and he said, without hesitation, I wouldn't let you go in alone. The courthouse steps were wide and white, baking in the afternoon sun. Inside, the air was heavy with paper and sweat and the rustle of boots. Lawyers with badges, men in suits. A few women who looked at Clara as she passed not with pity but recognition. Judge Chambers met them at the door. He greeted Clara with a nod and Eli with a firm handshake. We have a room prepared, he said. When you're ready, you'll give your testimony. No press, no crowd. Just a clerk and a court recorder. After that, we take it to the grand jury. Clara swallowed hard, then nodded. I'm ready. Eli stayed just outside the door. She looked back at him once before entering. He gave her the faintest smile, and she walked in. The room was small. The walls smelled of ink and old wood. A single man sat at a typewriter, waiting. Chambers sat beside her. Take your time, he said. Start wherever you want. Clara took a breath, closed her eyes. And began. She told them everything. About the brothel, the cage, the men who placed bets on her fate, the night she escaped, the auction, the cowboy who bought her with nothing but silence and a steady hand, cabin, the first time she picked up a gun not to survive, but to fight, the second time Eli spoke, and the moment she stopped running, not because she was safe, but because she'd chosen to stand her ground. When she finished, there was no applause. No cheers. Just a long silence and the rhythmic clacking of the typewriter, recording every word she'd finally been brave enough to speak. Outside, the wind picked up. She stepped out into the sun, blinking at the brightness. Eli stood waiting, hands in his pockets, a calm quiet in his eyes. She walked straight into him, arms wrapping around his middle, her face buried in his coat. It's done, she whispered. He rested his chin atop her head. It's just begun. They didn't stay long in Austin. There were too many buildings, too much noise, too many stairs. But as they rode out of town, past the river and the cottonwood trees, Clara carried something new with her, her name, her story, her strength, and the knowledge that the girl who'd been auctioned for $5 was no longer just a name on a paper. She was a voice, a storm, a force no man would ever silence again.